This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
This is the BBC. Dear brothers and sisters, all are welcome here at the Confessions podcast, whether saint or sinner.
Hello and welcome. It's another Confessions podcast from your friends at the BBC, where very, very sinful members of the public come to tell their tales of deceit, debauchery and deception. It's been going on for many decades. Anyway, they need forgiveness from you, the parish of Radio 2, and Bobby, and Joe.
And I have this week's batch of confessions in front of me now, and I can tell you what they are. We have Emma's ghost story, Black and Fright, Alan's naked naughtiness, I'm in love with a German theme park.
I like that one.
That was a fact. All of us love that one.
What a title that is.
Yeah. And Bob's confession, motor spiking. Plus we uncover another confession from the crypt, especially requested by one of you lot.
But we start this week's podcast with Ian's story, Miser Chiefs.
Please be seated.
Tonight's comes from Ian. Thank you so much, Ian, for tonight's tale. Dear Saint Simon and angelic Joe and beautiful Bobby. In the very early 1990s, when I was still a probationary constable in a Scottish police force, I was based in a small, picturesque seaside town, popular with tourists from all over the world. I think we've made this deliberately vague, a little bit of soft focus there. Normally there was little crime to deal with, so imagine the shock when an American who was cycling from Land's End to John O'Groats had his bicycle stolen along with all of his possessions. More or less the entire office, well, it's about 5 of us, were now on the case, and we had to find the bicycle as soon as possible. But as the day dragged on, nothing, not a single lead. Despite much assistance from the public, we weren't able to apprehend anyone or find the bicycle. By the evening, the poor American tourist was having to face ending his dream trip by sorting out money and sorting out a new passport. A calamity. Enter the chief inspector, the officer in charge, whose nickname was the Chocolate Fireguard, as that was how much use he was. I like that idea of a chief inspector being the Chocolate Fireguard. He'd been away that day and was oblivious to what had happened, so was a bit nonplussed when he found an American in his office phoning America to arrange for a transfer of funds. When it was explained to him what had happened, instead of showing understanding and sympathy, the chief inspector demanded that the sergeant find out how much the various phone calls the tourist had made was going to cost, and then present him with a bill for those calls once his money had arrived. It's fair to say this lack of any human empathy from the chief inspector didn't go down well with the sergeant, who stormed out of the room and literally tore a telephone directory in half. Because in those days, that was a substantial thing. Nowadays, it's just a flimsy little thing. But in those days, that's
taken a very long time.
Imagine having a copper who could actually literally tear a telephone directory in half. Anyway, it's fair to say this reflected all our moods. And at the end of the shift, we dealt with this anger the only way that we knew how. We hit the pub. The next day, back on duty, I was presented with a more mundane crime report to investigate. Turns out that during the night, 4 windows in the police store had been broken. This was more bad news for the chief inspector, who, having recouped the money for the phone calls from the poor tourist, now faced a bill from the local glazier to fit the windows. I threw myself into the inquiry. I knocked on some doors nearby. I asked the occupiers if they'd seen or heard anything suspicious, but drew a blank. I compiled a list of suspects, but they all had alibis. That's Crazy Tam and Jim Fingers Caper. Apparently innocent. It stayed a mystery. It stayed an unsolved crime, another tricky statistic. However, as it turned out, the culprit was not far away, because the person who'd broken the windows, says Ian, was actually me. You see, my walk home from the pub took me past the police store, and in a moment of madness, I decided that the chief inspector, Chief Chocolate Fireguard, having passed on the cost of the poor tourist's phone calls, should face a different kind of bill. I'd been careful to make sure no one was around, and there was nobody who could have seen what had happened. Thankfully, no one had when I went a-knocking, and they certainly didn't say, "Yes, I saw you do it, officer. It was you. Looked exactly like you, so it probably was you." So the crime went undetected, and the crime report was filed. To this day, no one knows who it was. So for that, Father Simon, I seek forgiveness, but not from the Chief Inspector, who was not a nice person at all. Instead, I seek forgiveness from the Sergeant, who, after having had to deal with the American tourist and then present him with a bill for the phone calls on the Chief Inspector's orders, then had to sort out getting the windows repaired on his boss's behalf. So you know, if you start this whole thing off very badly, then it's just going to get worse. And they clearly weren't used to crime in this particular popular Scottish picturesque seaside town, which we're not going to mention in case the Chief Inspector works out who he is. Anyway, what do you think, Joe?
Well, I think this is why you shouldn't drink, because it just leads to vandalism. Vandalry, is that word vandalism?
Vandalry. Enough vandalry.
Stop it with your vandalry. So I'm going to say not forgiven here, because I think it's a bit of a mean thing to have done. And there's not a shred of remorse here whatsoever, is there? So, no, I think definitely not forgiven.
So that's your word for any students on Freshers Week. No drinking, because it'll lead to...
yeah, if any of my kids are listening, no drinking, it'll just lead to...
vandalry.
Yeah.
Young Bobby.
Yeah, it's difficult to find a reason to forgive. It's also pointless. It doesn't fix anything. Obviously, you're annoyed, but you could have done loads of things. You could have raised money for the tourist. You could have paid the bill yourself if you were unhappy about how he was treated. You could have done all sorts of things yourself.
Yeah, but what you wanted to do was annoy the Chief Inspector.
Yeah, but he
By
didn't, because he didn't have
breaking
to.
stuff.
Yeah, but he didn't have to pay it out of his own pocket, did he? It would have come out of the taxpayers' money. So it's one of those things that he achieved nothing. I understand the frustration, but that's where you have to put your frustration into a good place, and that wasn't a good place. Breaking those windows. It's just, well, I understand. Yeah, it's silly. It's just, I know you're young, but Ian, you're not forgiven. You could have been a bit more creative.
The Confessions Podcast.
Tonight's comes from Alan. Alan, thank you very much. Your confessions, always welcome. confessions@bbc.co.uk. Alan says, Simon and his assemblage of able absolvers. This tale takes us back about 10 years to when I lived in Germany, the lovely city of Heidelberg, to be precise. The gorgeous little place that's home to Germany's oldest university. There's also a beautiful Schloss castle there, mountains of German sausages and mountains of potatoes. And at that time, our family, me, my better half, and our 3 children, then aged between 5 and 12. It was a good life, but as with any expats, we missed people from back home. So in the summer in question, we invited lots of groups of friends to come and stay for a bit. However, only one lot took us up on the offer. For the purposes of this tale, we'll call them the Blands. They were 2 parents and their 2 kids, same ages as ours, which is how we knew them, really, basically through their children. The parents were lovely enough, and you know the sort. No strong opinions to have a great argument with over a few beers, no silliness, everything straight and proper and quiet. Their kids had fun with ours, and we tried to have fun with the adults, and it was okay. They were lovely, lovely people. Just a little bit dull, a little bit straight. So nearly a week into their visit, we'd done all the normal tourist things in the city. We'd walked the lovely Flossenweg at least twice, seen the student jail, the Schloss, again, with its famous big barrel. We ate German sausages and German potatoes, as I think I might have mentioned. But before long, we were running out of things to do, and our conversation was drying up. They just didn't seem that interested in what we wanted to show them, and expressed little desire to see or do any particular thing. Then my better half reminded me of a place, a water park that's not too distant from Heidelberg, with a selection of slides and a wave machine for the kids and a thermal bath and spa with saunas, massages for the adults. Well done, that's going to fill an afternoon, we thought. What a fine idea. We suggested it and could see the parents were unsure, but their kids strongly hinted that they needed to go to this place. So the following afternoon we headed there. We had a whale of a time. The 6 kids, 5 actual children, and me, had a ball sliding the slides and jumping about in the waves. Mr. Bland tried to join in a bit and even seemed to loosen up just a touch. Mrs. Bland was a bit overwhelmed by the noise and the bustle, but coped by having lots of rests in the sauna and a dip or 5 in the hot, minerally pools of the spa. And we all ate our tea in the very good cafe, yet more German sausage and more German potato. After a couple of hours, the Bland parents wanted to leave, but their kids convinced them to stay a little bit longer, to which they grudgingly agreed. About 10 minutes after this, the children and I were all playing in the main pool, while my wife and the Blands were sitting on some loungers. And then this happened. What do you think that's going to mean?
I think it's the big wave machine.
Are they on a cruise? Inadvertently.
Alan says it was at this point that pretty much every single other person in the place took off their clothes.
Oh.
Bathing suits included. That's right, the water park in an instant became a nudist water park.
Wow.
And our guests' faces were a sight to behold. I think I heard an actual gasp from Mrs. Bland as her jaw hung agape. After a moment, towels were whisked out and their children were ushered quickly towards the changing rooms. We hurried after them with our apologies ringing out, "We're ever so sorry. We are so sorry. We had no idea." And we headed away from the pool. This, though, really is our confession. It's not that we feel guilty for labelling these lovely folk as boring stick-in-the-muds, but the fact of the matter is that we did know about the sudden nudity. We did know what that meant. We'd heard it before. We're a bit surprised on our first time, to be honest, but when in Germany, it's not unheard of to see the occasional naked person. Anyway, they seem a lot less hung up than the Brits. Anyway, not only that, but we actually picked this particular day of the week to go for this story to play out. Our kids also knew that this would happen, and they'd played along with us even when we asked them not to tell their friends about it. In fact, it was with our eldest's help that we managed to cajole their kids, to cajole their parents to stay long enough so we'd be there when the naked siren went off.
Do it again.
It's the naked siren, everybody. So I have to ask forgiveness from you for all subjecting these lovely, if straight folk to the sight of a few hundred naked Germans of all ages and sizes. In our defence, the conversation flowed much more easily that evening, as we all had something new and interesting to discuss. And I'm sure it was a great anecdote for them on their way home. I'm sure it was, amongst many other things. Alan, thank you very much indeed. First confession of the week, very good, very exciting. Joe, what do you think?
Superb, absolutely superb. Desperate times call for desperate measures, obviously, and they were having the dullest week of their lives with these unfortunate people who they just weren't compatible with. I'm sure.
They did invite them in the first place.
Yeah, true. But no, there's nothing to forgive. Don't blame them in the slightest. But I would like to know, did they get naked as well? Did they strip off?
No, I think they didn't. I think they just said, let's all just go
They
away.
played the prank and then they just legged it. But then at least they had something to talk about in the evening.
They did, and it all went right, and the conversation flowed much more happily.
This is
after
great.
that.
This is just too great. Totally forgiven.
Young Bobby.
Yeah, I think they didn't, because otherwise that tea time, that following on tea time, would not have been so great. I don't. Also, I'm a little bit confused. Is why at the swimming pool? Why do you only get naked at the sound of a siren? Why isn't it naked all the time? Why is it, okay, clothes on, clothes off? Is it, I suppose, some people don't want to,
Maybe
so
it's
they
a
give you a warning.
or maybe you know that
So
it's
you
6 o'clock or
okay,
something.
Okay, that's it, clothes off time.
And people know when to arrive to take off their clothes.
And then to leave before the 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
Oh, right, I see, right, okay.
I've never heard of this before, though. Have you?
Can you actually imagine going to a swimming bath with slides and waves? And
Imagine the
Ow.
burns.
and then the naked hooter going off.
Is there extra chlorine in the water then?
Definitely
Anyway,
don't wanna go anywhere near
I think,
that.
having said that, I do think it's very funny, and it's difficult if you're with people that are not, So actually, in this case, I'm going to forgive.
The Confessions Podcast.
That was Alan's confession. I'm in love with the German theme park. I think it's just worth repeating the title every now and again because it just scans and feels excellent. And it caused listeners to text in with other naked sports activities, obviously. I don't particularly agree with it.
Also, I've got Rosemary. Of course, forgiven. I saw naked tennis in Munich.
What, deliberately?
Happens.
It doesn't happen.
Obviously, it does in Munich and it does in Heidelberg.
Naked
According
tennis?
to-
I'm not going to look that
It's a
up.
feeling of liberation. Still not tempted?
Well, no, absolutely not. Either not tempted to play it fully clothed, never mind. But who is genuinely tempted by naked tennis?
Well, the thing
Seriously.
No.
I think there are times when you need support, whatever sport you're playing,
Yes.
depending on your shape and size, but mainly your shape. I mean, you need support sometimes. So
Surely the only naked sport that makes sense is naked swimming. I can understand how that might, under some circumstances, you think, okay, fair enough. But any other sport without clothing?
Watching it, can you imagine how hideous that would be?
Well, no, it would just be very funny because human bodies are hilarious, and especially maybe moving in ways that you don't normally see them.
Why would
Or
you
that
choose?
jiggling.
My point
I
is,
don't know.
why would you choose to play if you had the choice between playing tennis in the nude or playing tennis with shorts and a shirt and some shoes and socks? Let's just say,
Yeah, you need grip, don't you?
Well,
Again, we go back to the liberation, I suppose. That just some people fancy it.
do you think? I'm not saying that it should be banned. I just can't really understand why someone would choose it.
Still to come on this week's podcast, find out what caused an outcry in this spooky confession.
OMG, it's the woman in black, like really? I'm going to play that again.
Do it again.
OMG, it's the woman in black, like really? Great acting.
Simon is a teenage girl. Before we hear more from Simon's alter ego, Holly, it's time now for one of our favourite parts of the podcast.
Yeah, heading over to the parish notice board to find out what you, the parish, have been gossiping about. And Bobby, what have you got?
Well, Eleanor writes, she says, Dear Simon, Joe and Bobby, I'm writing you from Yangon in Myanmar, where we're currently living and working for the next 2 months. During my taxi commute to work, I have been working through the back catalogue of Confessions podcasts that I have missed. In theory, my commute is only about 10 minutes. However, with the ridiculous traffic in Yangon, which I understand because there are queues on the Bailey Bridge, I understand getting across the creek, Eleanor, you find yourself getting through an entire podcast on your journey. Now, she writes, the other morning I was chuckling so much as I listened to my favourite confession, which involves an hilarious prank played on an innocent new air hostess, and the taxi driver actually asked what I was listening to. I attempted to explain the concept of confessions, and if it didn't get lost in translation, which I'm rather sure it did, you may have found yourself a new subscriber. Cool. Thanks very much for accompanying me on my morning commutes and helping me settle into my new life in a new city. Eleanor.
Which is really nice. Maybe we could include some traffic news for Myanmar, maybe in future, maybe, because clearly she quite liked that.
It's the 3 bridges across the creek that caused the biggest problem, and
Yeah.
there was roadworks last week. Yeah.
Okay,
So,
and are they more or less cleared up?
Nope, they're going to be there for ages.
Okay. Anyway, very happy to get another subscriber in Myanmar. If that taxi driver has just joined us, you're very welcome. Joe, what have you got?
I have an email from a Mr. Tim Bromley who says, I stole my wife's phone while she was binge-watching Grey's Anatomy and subscribed her to the Confessions podcast. My daughter was in on it and has subscribed herself as well. I'm now on a mission to subscribe the whole family with my daughter's help, including her brother and both sets of grandparents. Surely this amount of effort deserves whatever tat you are currently trying to dispose of. I like the phrasing there, tat you are currently trying to dispose of. Oh, I see what you've reached for there. I know what that is.
Well, there was a plectrum that was on the floor yesterday. I don't think it might have been left by one of our artists.
It was.
Was it? Who left it?
Katie Tunstall.
Katie Tunstall's
Yes.
plectrum. That's got to be worth
So
something.
that's genuine. That's not tat.
No.
And so that's not tat, that's the real thing. Plus, our tat correspondent, Rosie, has just delivered... What's this?
It's only the biggest weekend. Merch. Merch it's called.
It's the biggest weekend in Perth with Noel Gallagher, Simple Minds, Emily Sandé, Squeeze.
And it's
Shy.
perfect.
It's a nice T-shirt.
Yeah, whatever size you are, because if you're small, you wear it in bed.
And you can fit 5 members of your family inside as well.
Good thinking, Joe.
And there's a key ring. It doesn't look like a BBC piece of tat. It just sounds like something we've found on the street. Oh, whoops, beg your pardon. A tourist has dropped it and we've just helped ourselves.
Is that biggest weekend keyring?
Is it?
Well, spotted, Simon.
Is it from a
Branding's
TV
really
show for a
working.
3-year-old child? Could be either of those.
Anyway, that plus Katie Tunstall's plectrum, which is pretty fine. So thank you very much indeed. Good work, Tim. Anyway, your reward will be in the post. Are we saying? Are we going to post it? Okay. Don't say we don't know how to spoil you.
It's now time for the naughty part of the notice board. So the non-compliant confessions that didn't make it to the radio for a number of reasons. These are confessions from shameless people who clearly have no moral compass. Why do you always give me that phrase to say when you know I can't say it?
Well, we think in a few weeks you might have got it.
No chance. Or any idea what's suitable for tea time listening.
Steve, as a housemaster, you should know that honesty is always the best policy, which begs the question, when you accidentally broke the old-fashioned lavatory clean off the wall whilst doing your business at school, why did you think walking away and leaving it and your slowly creeping mess was the right thing to do? Apparently the headmaster nearly had a heart attack when he saw it, and you let local vandals take the blame. Steve, hang your head in shame.
One of the phrases I hate more than anything else in the world is that phrase, doing your business, or doing their business. Oh, it turns my stomach.
But there's a difference between your business and the business.
That's very true.
What, the business news?
No,
The business I can deal with, your business, no.
No.
And staying on that kind of theme, Sally Sunshine's tale of the midwives teaching an uppity new doctor a lesson was particularly funny. The punchline of sticking your finger in a soiled nappy, then tasting it to see if the baby was healthy, however, isn't suitable for tea time radio.
Fine.
That's why it didn't go out, even if it was only Marmite.
That's good. I'd have let that go through. What's wrong with these producers these days? They don't know anything.
They have those moral things.
No feces in Rose's story, but it does feature a car, a happy squirrel, then a dead squirrel, and a complete lack of sympathy from Rosie, who moans that the roads in her area are now filled with slow down for squirrel signs, which she says are a waste of taxpayers' money. So it sounds as though there's a heartless feature that runs through that particular confession, as well as dead squirrels. What?
Don't like anything with dead anything. And I think... Go on.
Oh, you're so hardcore.
Time now to get back to the confessions that did make the cut this week. We have Bob's story, motor spiking.
The Confessions Podcast.
Tonight comes from Bob. Just signed Bob. And he starts it, Dear Bobby, Joe and Simon. So it's like reordering. That's
a first.
No, that's fine. I'll take that. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, my dad worked for the government, printing Hansard, the official report of what goes on in Parliament. And as a result was sworn by the Official Secrets Act, meaning he couldn't divulge what was being discussed. Very interesting opening paragraph, Bob. In around 1969 or 1970, there was a lot of talk of petrol rationing. And so with this piece of classified information, my dad started to keep those red tins that held around 2 gallons of petrol each, with petrol in. Before long, the shelves around our garage were filled with these. But inevitably, the crisis blew over, and there we were with dozens of these full cans in our garage. There's a couple of things you should know before I go on with the story. The first is that my dad worked nights. And the second thing was that at the time, I was an apprentice earning very low wages. Such low wages you can't possibly imagine. Okay, Bob, get on with it. I ran a moped, a motorbike, and a car. That's probably why I didn't have that much money left. But the one thing I was always short of was obviously petrol. So I devised a devious plan to make good use of all this 4-star petrol that was just hanging around in our garage. As the weeks went by, I'd borrow a tin for the night, but I knew I needed to be smart. My dad was no fool, you see, and every now and again he'd put his hand up onto the shelf and at random lift one to see if the weight was right. Well, of course it would be. I'd refilled them with water.
Oh, God.
I mean, what could possibly go wrong? And then one day my dad bought this MGB GT.
Oh, no.
Brand new. My dad would drive his new Pride and Joy from Newark to Haywards Heath Station every morning. Every evening, beg your pardon. But then on one fateful night, when I was eating my steak and kidney pie, he was busy filling his car up with water.
No.
I didn't even go and see him
Blimey.
into this night, and frankly, I'm amazed he got a mile down the road before it spluttered to an undignified, although abrupt, final halt. So I received a phone call. Dad had broken down. Can you rescue him? No mobile phones, obviously. On the drive out there, it dawned on me what had happened, but the RAC had beaten me to it. The engineer exclaimed, well, of course it's not going to go. It's got water in it. My dad looked sternly at me and said, I know who this is, don't I? I suppose you do? I do know, don't I? I held my breath, knowing what was coming. It's your Uncle Eric, isn't it? I knew it. I knew he was up to no good. He was at the house last week, remember? I'm going to have him for this, you see if I don't.
Gosh.
So my dad marches round to Uncle Eric's with me in tow, and I stood there with my mouth open wide and watched the whole ugly argument unfold in front of my eyes. It was a bad one. It was the row to end all rows, and after that night, they never spoke again. I know I could have stopped it in an instant by just confessing, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Now let's fast forward 30 years, and me and Dad are having a drink somewhere when I finally decided that I had to tell him. To my shock, Dad just laughed and said he suspected it was me all along, but because he hated his brother so much, he decided this was an opportunity he couldn't
This is
miss.
deep.
This is a twist Adele Parks could have written. In fact, Dad told me he couldn't wait for the words, I'm never coming back to yours ever again, to come out of Eric's mouth. Just as I was counting my lucky stars, Dad added with a wink, you ever do something like that again, I will kill you. And looking into his eyes, I realised there and then that he probably would. So there's some dark characters on the way when we talk to Adele Parks. But anyway, that's Bob's story. Very dangerous, of course. You don't want to be swapping petrol for water, water for petrol. Anyway, we're deep into family dispute territory. What do you say, Joe?
Question. Bob's dad, was he Ray Winston? Just wondering.
Always, it's a knee-jerk reaction.
He has many children.
Yes, that's true.
Well, there's nothing to forgive here because he was used and abused. It wasn't particularly. I mean, obviously he did a ridiculous thing, but as his dad knew exactly what he was doing, and if he hated his brother that much, that's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing. So I'm forgiving Bob completely.
All right, Sister Bobby.
No, I think there are many people that need forgiving. I mean, Bob's dad creating a fire hazard in the first place. I understand the motivation, but a lovely mention of 4-star there.
I know. I was going to say that. Yeah, taking you right back.
Fill her up, 4-star, five and sixpence.
It was 2-star in my Skoda. There you go. But I have to say, Bob, you shouldn't have done this in the first place. You are not forgiven. You know motors. You love motors. You don't do that to anybody's car. So you're not forgiven on that. But also your dad's not forgiven either for what he did to his brother. I mean, if you've got a dispute, sort it out. Don't try and kind of offload it some way. So actually, your dad and yourself are not forgiven. on many different levels.
Sister Bobby, not happy.
Yeah, so you're just condemning everybody, basically.
Well, they're just really naughty.
Everyone involved.
I'm just worried about the family dynamics. It's terrible.
Yeah. Well, these things can be sparked by mere trivial items, and Bob was at the heart of it.
The Confessions Podcast.
Tonight's confession comes from Emma, the vicar's wife. Thank you, Emma, the vicar's wife. That's how she signs it. Father Simon, the Collective. I'm writing with a confession which has haunted me for 16 years, and now I finally feel it's time to lift the ghost of my sins past. My story dates back to when I worked as an assistant house mother in a girls' boarding school before starting my teacher training. The school ran a theatre trip, taking every girl in Year 10 to see the long-running Gothic horror play The Woman in Black in London. As drama was my degree subject and I was keen to show I was a willing member of the school's staff team, I was quick to volunteer to accompany the trip. Now, anyone who's been to see this play will instantly go, oh, okay, this is a seriously scary play.
It is.
And if you want to know, I mean, frankly, teachers, you should have known better. Now, this was an annual school trip, and the girls who had been the year before always wound the younger girls up by declaring, quote, "It's like the most scary thing ever." This meant that on the bus all the way to London, the girls were getting more and more highly strung about how petrified they were going to be. I kept battling away their comments and reminding them that it's the theatre, it's acting. They should all remain calm. Needless to say, by the time we were at the theatre, the 60 girls were shaking with anticipation, and I was determined to show them that they were being ridiculous. So I told them firmly to take their seats, and I sat myself on the end of the row, shushing them as the show began. Now, I won't spoil the play for those who haven't seen it, but needless to say, after about 20 minutes, I was the first to leap out of my chair in shock upon the arrival of the character central to the story. Even more embarrassing, though, my hysterical yelp began a Mexican wave of screams along the row as girl by girl they turned to see what I'd seen. The rest of the play was brilliantly performed and held the tension and attention of every member of the audience, especially a scene later on involving a music box. This detail is important to lay the context to my truly shameful act, which came out later that night. But there's a very key moment when this happens. Now, once the play was over, we loaded into the coach to return, and the girls spoke non-stop for 2 hours about how it had been so, horrifying, and that they each feared that the woman in black herself was going to get them that night. Once we returned to school, we headed back to the boarding houses, where I told them to get ready for bed as it was getting late. However, they continued the topics from the coach by emitting a constant stream of, "OMG, that was so scary," and can you believe how terrified I am right now? The woman in black is totally going to get me. I don't know. Am I doing this justice?
You're doing brilliant. No, this is so good.
At this point, the little demon in me hatched a plan to test just how really scared they actually were. My room was at the end of a long corridor with the girls' bedrooms on each side so that I could monitor action all the way along. As they got into bed, still ignoring my instructions to settle down and go to sleep, I systematically turned off the lights and plunged the dorms and corridors into darkness. About 20 minutes later, and 3 lots of me reminding them to stop talking and go to sleep, they began to hush a little, and this is when the wickedness kicked in, for you see, Father Simon, I owned a music box, one very much like the one which had been so terrifying in the play, and I tiptoed to my room to collect the box, then tiptoed back down the corridor before stopping between the Year 10 girls' rooms. I took a breath, held the box close to the doors, turned the key. As soon as I heard the first shriek and whisper of, OMG, it's the woman in black, like really? I pegged it back to my room so as not to be in the corridor if they dared to come out looking for the spectre. Almost as soon as I was out of sight, I heard their doors open and panicked voices emerge. This was my cue. I drew my shoulders back, put on a stern face, marched out the corridor, demanding, what is this fuss? Why are you out of bed? I even went so far as to tell them off for disturbing girls from the younger years. I was greeted with 10 quaking girls who each told me they had heard a music box and that it must be a ghost. I don't know how I didn't laugh, but instead dismissed their claims as ridiculous before assuring them that it was probably just creaking pipes, which eventually they agreed could be the case. After a few more rounds of, it's just your overactive imagination, for me, they headed back to bed. OMG, like the woman in black, she was really here. I chuckled inwardly and snuggled down that night with my hot chocolate, and only did this twice more. Anyway, dearest Father Simon, I seek forgiveness from those frankly over-dramatic Year 10 boarders for my actions, which I did eventually fess up to them a few years later when I left to train as a teacher. But moreover, I seek forgiveness from the boarders in the house who had not seen the play, but who were told the story of the house ghost by the Year 10s and spent the following year challenging each other to stay awake and listen for the haunting strains of Fur Elise coming down the pipes. It was the sign of the house ghost and so on. Anyway, Emma, the vicar's wife, who wants some forgiveness, who could ask the vicar, I suppose, if she was that desperate. But anyway, it's the Radio 2 collective she's turning to, and Joe goes first.
Not forgiving in any way, shape or form. I mean, having kids who've always needed quite a lot of reassurance when it comes to school trips and plays and that kind of thing. And I always go and speak to people and say, you will look after them, it will all be fine, won't it? And now I have very little faith in anyone who takes anybody on a school trip, really. And the phrasing that she uses, Emma, the little demon in me, and the wickedness kicked in. I mean, it's really, really, it's not right. It's not a nice thing, is it?
No, it's not. Young Bobby.
I'm going to forgive, because I think it's...
What?
I know.
What?
I know it's unlikely.
You're so contrary.
Because I think it was inspired. I think it was fantastic. And those girls were never going to sleep anyway through that night. So actually she gave themselves something actually real to hear, because they would have imagined it all night long. They were never going to rest. If you take 60 girls to go and see a thriller like that, I mean, there's the mistake in the first place. I think what she did was great fun.
They would have been damaged for life.
The Confessions Podcast.
That was Emma's confession, Black and Fright, which caused one listener to share a confession that didn't end so well.
Chris in Murfield, completely forgiven. I once scared my younger sister so much, she screamed so loud she dislocated her jaw. It's good to scare kids. It's character building. I'm not sure about that.
Not that much. I like that.
Is that possible?
That's almost it from this week's batch of confessions. If you want to send in your own secret, a cringy catastrophe or just bad behaviour, just shock us. Email confessions@bbc.co.uk. Don't go anywhere just yet. It's time for our weekly trawl through the archives to dig out a confession from the crypt.
Which I have here. It's been requested by Sharon, who says, Dear Simon, I'm wondering if it would be possible to find a confession that was played, I think 2013, possibly around November. I was on my way to work and sadly never got to hear the end of the confession, and this is something that I still think about to this day. From what I can remember, a family, mum, dad and at least 2 children, going on a very, very long road trip through the middle of nowhere, and in the boot of the car was a jack, just in case of an emergency wheel change. The young boy in the confession took the jack out of the boot and either broke it or didn't put it back after playing with it. The car journey became rather fractious, and somewhere in the middle of nowhere, the car promptly broke down. Dad went to get the jack and on discovering it wasn't there cried out, "We're all going to die!"
Very good.
this was as much of the confession that I heard. I really hope you have enough information to be able to find it, because I would love to find out what happened in the end. Did they live? Thank you again, Joe D.
Well, if they had all died, we probably wouldn't have read out the confession. It would have been a little bit tasteless. But we have found the confession, Joe, and here it is. It's called, rather predictably, Y Viva España.
The Confessions Podcast.
This one is from Sam, who sends in tonight's tale. Father Simon in the assembled assembly. My confession goes back to 1971 and has weighed heavy on my heart since the day I accidentally learnt my first words in Spanish. So, Father Simon, be prepared for your unique skills in accents. Always a challenging moment. And your Spanish accent, of course, Matt, will you have to sit in judgment?
This is going to be,
August the 1st was a special day in the lives of every boy between the ages of 5 and 55. For August the 1st was the day every year that the new car registration plates were released. In 1971, the new reg plate was K. I ran home from playing out that day with an extra spring in my step, for this was the day that my dad was presenting to us, his family, his new company car, on the very day that the registration plate came out. A massive day for every boy in the era. I have never been more proud when, surrounded by bullying school friends who were waiting for the ultimate fail, my dad proudly delivered to our house a beautiful K-Reg red Hillman Hunter estate car. It was the newest, shiniest, longest and reddest car on our estate, and it put every other car there to shame, what with their D-Reg Ford Anglias and their F-Reg Triumph Heralds. I don't think so. My dad had the newest car on the estate, and for about 20 minutes I was the proudest 7-year-old in the neighbourhood. I say 20 minutes because that is roughly the amount of time it took me to destroy everything connected to that car. The car my dad was so proud to show off to my mum, the car that the neighbours were so keen to stroke and sit in, and add comments and suggestions to my dad as to how he should take it on the proposed trip to the Algarve, which was our summer holiday that year. Father Simon, in those days, a trip to the Algarve was a road trip of epic proportions, which started with a sea passage from Plymouth to Bilbao. So 20 minutes into ownership of the pride of my estate, my dad decided that before the following day's trip to Portugal, he should carry out James May-esque pre-flight checks with me, his willing 7-year-old assistant, now proudly promoted to chief engineer. Together in a father and son moment, the likes of which we never shared before or since, we opened the bonnet to see where the water and oil went. We even jacked the car up so we knew where the jacking points were and how to operate the jack in the event of a flat tyre type emergency. My dad checked that the Hillman Hunter's jack worked perfectly, which it did, and then gave me the important job of putting everything back, whilst he went for a well-deserved bacon butty. Everything went back perfectly into the Hillman Hunter's craftily designed spare wheel space, everything except for the jack. No matter how I positioned the jack into the storage area, I could not get the thing to fit back into its space and then fit the cardboard and carpet over the Hillman's ample rear storage space. The jack just seemed to be too long to fit. If only I could make the jack shorter somehow. But as a 7-year-old chief engineer, I lacked the strength and or the mechanical experience to wind the jack down completely. In desperation to please my dad, I took a lump hammer to the jack.
Oh, yes.
Always good. And hammered it enough to fit into the place where it was originally designed to fit, obviously completely ruining the jack's winding thread in the process. But hey, it now fitted, and as the old saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. The following afternoon, then, we embarked on our epic trip to the Algarve. There was Dad driving, Mum navigating, Grandma sat behind Mum, my 8-year-old brother, me age 7, my little brother age 3, and my littlest baby brother, who was just 5 months old, who occupied a carry cot in the Hillman's spacious luggage area behind the rear seat. With 2 roof racks on the Hillman Hunter, we set off for Plymouth. How can you have 2? Eventually, we boarded our car ferry for Spain via the notorious Bay of Biscay. The crossing was not smooth. In fact, we all suffered from seasickness, especially my baby brother, who was violently ill all the way to Spain, where we thankfully disembarked 18 hours later. Heading through Spain was a long, painful affair. Adults suffering from seasickness, kids whinging about, are we there yet? And my little brother's nappies being filled and stinking the car out on a half-hourly basis. It could not have been worse. Until... bang! Rumble, rumble, rumble. A flat rear tyre on the Hillman. My dad summoned me, the chief engineer, and we put into action our well-rehearsed plan of the day before, with a few differences. My dad placed the jack under the jacking point and attempted to raise the car. He muttered something under his breath, He examined the jack. He broke down in tears at the side of the road in the middle of this Spanish desert. And then the shouting started. My mum accused him of not checking the jack, him adamant that he did, me silent, my brothers asking if we were there yet, my baby brother producing yet more nappy material, my grandma asking if she could help, my dad losing his temper. Well, we were stumped. The trip had come to a halt. There was nobody around in this Spanish wasteland and no cars had passed in hours. Surely we were going to die.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, it would be a first.
Yeah.
Actually, it wouldn't, but anyway, that's another story. In the middle of this catastrophe, my mother gave me a special job of disposing of the latest offering for my baby brother. I missed that bit out. My mother suggested that I find the biggest rock that I could and bury the offending nappy under it. I wandered off the road with the nuclear waste held at arm's length, looking for a big rock. I found such a rock, so heavy it took me 5 minutes to roll it out of the position that it had rested in since the last ice age. I stuck the nuclear waste under it and then I rolled it back into position. Nappy duly hidden, I returned to try and console my father, who was by now swinging the jack above his head and smashing it against the road, eventually flinging the offending jack into a nearby field. And then a miracle happened. Out of the haze came about 6 Guardia civil officers on motorbikes. I was instantly impressed by the gleaming bikes, the shiny leather boots, the pistols, the tight pantaloons, the moustaches. These were the pride of General Franco's elite military police. Here was help. We might not die after all. One Guardia civil junior officer was obviously a family man. He smiled at us, flirted with my mother, and kissed my grandma's hand. I liked him. In my mind, he was my hero. The captain barked instructions to the junior officers, some of which I could understand. Inglés was one word I understood. Well, actually, that was it. They explained something to my dad using hand gestures, and he announced that to get us out of the car, the nice policemen were going to lift the car up by hand whilst he changed the tyre. Well, we bailed out. They lifted the car by hand. My dad tried to remove the flat tyre, and then the coppers dropped the car before we could get the wheel off. The Hillman Hunter was not, I should remind you, a light car, especially with 2 roof racks on and Granny still inside.
Get out the car!
The policeman then had a rethink, and the captain came up with possibly the best idea he had ever had, but also possibly the worst idea as far as my Guardia Civil junior officer was concerned. The captain turned to Miguel, for that is what I had secretly called him, and gave him an instruction. Although I couldn't speak a word of Spanish, being only 7, I understood with dread every word that was being said. It was, in a Spanish accent now, Simon, Miguel, go and find the biggest rock you can and bring it here so we can put it under the car. He's slightly Russian, Miguel.
Extraordinary accent.
Under the car next time we lift it. I gave up in the end.
Yeah.
He's got to go and get a rock.
Yeah.
I wanted to stop it happening. I wanted to warn, I really, really wanted to warn everybody precisely what was going to happen. But I wanted to warn Miguel the most. I was rooted to the spot. Miguel headed off in the direction I'd returned from 20 minutes previously and returned with my rock, held securely in both arms against his stomach, and unbeknownst to Miguel, my baby brother's nappy attached to it, gently flapping against his crisply ironed green pantaloons, ceremoniously releasing green goo all down his beautiful black leather boots. He only realised that he was covered in what I now believe the Spanish to be called caca, when he had placed the rock under the car that his colleagues had lifted. As his colleagues covered their noses and pointed at Miguel in a mocking way, I then learnt some more words in Spanish, which I've since discovered are not repeatable in a religious setting such as this. The tyre was eventually changed successfully, albeit with looks that could kill, from Miguel, and we rapidly continued our journey without incident. As we set off from that hell, waving to the nice policeman through the rear window, heated on the Hillman, you know, I felt remorse at seeing Miguel attempt to wipe off my baby brother's offerings from his beautiful boots. I'd like to beg forgiveness for my negligence as chief engineer on this trip when I maliciously destroyed the jack, and for my negligence in not finding a bigger rock under which to hide my baby brother's nappy, and for my negligence in not warning Miguel of the existence of toxic luminous goo on the nappy attached to my rock. With greatest remorse, that's Sam who sends in tonight's tale. Well, so we have the first time General Franco has had a mention in any confession, so for that reason, and it ties in nicely with your nappy story in the next hour.
Yes. That sounds like a scene from my life, I have to say, with, nappies and poo
And
and
pantaloons.
people shouting and chaos and pantaloons. Yes, exactly. I think
'Cause you're half
nobody nobody in their right mind would have admitted to having put the nappy there. You would just pretend it was somebody else's nappy, wouldn't you? Even if that place had never been, a human hadn't
think it was
set
a little
foot in
fresh.
that place for days or months. I think the father was a little bit responsible for having left his 7-year-old in charge as chief engineer to put all the parts back in the boot of the car. And the idea of the 7-year-old with a lump hammer and a jack is, in these days of health and safety, is, it's a bit alarming, really. So I think the father's got some responsibility here. So I don't blame Sam at all. Sam, you're completely forgiven.
Okay, that's one vote. What do we think?
That was an outstanding story. That was really funny. I agree with Rebecca about this. What's this father doing, leaving his son to sort out everything with it when he's 7? And I love the idea that he's there having his tea and little Sam goes past with a lump hammer. Where's Sam going? Where's our 7-year-old going with the lump hammer? So yeah, and also I think everyone listening to this story now is going, do you know what? Just before we go out in the car tonight, let's make sure we've got the jack and make sure that it works, because I don't want that happening to me. So I'm definitely going to forgive, because it was very funny, and it's obviously the dad's fault anyway.
And I actually would quite like to have a Hillman Hunter at the end of all that. Sam clearly still loves the
and a
Hillman
Guardia
Hunter.
Civil uniform.
The Confessions Podcast.
And that was the confession from the crypt this week, featuring Brother Matt and Rebecca is in there as well, and my very fine Spanish.
It is. I was going to say it was one of your finest French pronunciations. Is that what it was?
Excuse me, it was Spanish.
You were very European, but it is one of the best.
Yeah. Do you think?
Yes.
Well, I think sometimes a generic European accent is useful for unity in these difficult and troubled times.
You borrow from each language, yes.
Yes, that's right. So
Isn't it
it's
called
just
Esperanto?
vaguely foreign.
Something like that. If you have a request for a vintage confession, then do send in as many details as you can. Anything you remember, including when we first read it out, that helps a lot. To confessions@bbc.co.uk, and we'll do our very best to dig them out from the crypt.
So nearly time to say goodbye for another week. Regular listeners will know each week we ask you to tweet us a special code phrase to prove you've listened all the way to the end and that you're hardcore. Thanks to Colin and Adi and Sue and Ed and Mr. Paney for everyone who tweeted, I'll be shark, you be banana.
Oh, we never did that thing.
Although obviously you can't say banana because of your new imposed pronunciation. You have to say banana. This week's code phrase is bandana in my pagoda.
Pergola.
Any kind of variation will be perfectly fine.
We'll accept anything. And that's it for this week. If you have something to get off your chest, then send in your own confession to confessions@bbc.co.uk.
If you haven't already done so, don't forget to subscribe to the Confessions podcast. And remember, you can hear us 5 o'clock weekdays on BBC Radio 2. Goodbye, Joe.
Goodbye, Simon.
Bye, Bobby.
Cheerio.
The Confessions Podcast. Go in peace.